like you, I mentor people, and I have imposter syndrome. I finally figured out what that is. I mean, I've been accused of being aggressive and intimidating. It's usually from people I've learned that are too insecure to understand that, but I don't think they mean it as an insult, but from someone that they're saying it to, I took it as like they were criticizing me. So the one thing that came to me, and it's still something now that I resonate on, is the gentleman that hired me at Consumer Brands, Jeff Freeman. He said to me, quit trying to prove that you need to be in the room. You are going to alienate other people. They're not going to recognize that it's your insecurities. They are going to see it as you're either a know-it-all, you're intimidating. He goes, stop having to prove that you're in the room. You're in the room because you're smart enough to be in the room. Be in the room and do the job I hired you for.
Welcome to MeatsPad. It's a platform dedicated to share breakthrough knowledge that is accessible to the global meat industry. On each episode, you'll have the opportunity to listen and learn from meat specialists and professionals about the whole meat industry. This podcast is brought to you by Ultrasource, equipment and supplies for the meat and food industry. Viscofan collagen casings, the best alternative to animal gut casings for a better taste and sustainable sausage making.
All right, well, good morning. Here with the MeatsPad guys and Betsy, who is the current president of AMSA.
I am.
I've known Betsy since she was a graduate student. I was still young in my career at that point.
Very much.
And we're here at RMC in Columbus, Ohio, and taking the opportunity to find out a little bit more about Betsy and her path and what she would tell her 25-year-old self. And most importantly, you've spent the last year as the AMSA president. What are the things that you are most proud of what the organization has done?
It's pretty simple. I didn't help contribute driving the organization in the ditch. I mean, let's be honest. You sort of start, and the goal is I hope it's not bad on my watch. No, here's what I'm proud of. I think the organization, and I have been part of this organization by accident becoming a second-generation meat scientist. I've been part of this organization indirectly since I was a toddler. I've attended more RMCs as a child and traveling in the Delta 88 across many states with maybe air conditioning or not. So I know this organization. I know it as someone who was a child. I know it as a fledgling student when the students were just really becoming organized, and then know it as a professional member. I mean, technically I'm a grown-up from a professional standpoint since I graduated. But that has really evolved. And I think what's really exciting about AMSA, we value our tradition, our legacy, and yet we are not the same organization we were 5 years ago. We are not the same organization we were 10 years ago, in the best possible way of we're growing, we're evolving, we're maturing, and I believe really representing our industry and meat scientists. And that looks different than it did when this organization started. We're on the 78th RMC. It's a very different conference. You had to be sponsored. It was primarily academics. And now when you look at the demographics, I think we're almost 50-50 with students and professionals. You look at the amount of industry, what I would call ancillary industry, but the supportive industry, not necessarily packers and processors. They're here too, but we're bringing in and hopefully demonstrating that the community of meat science, it's many shades of meat science, and there's a lot of variety of students. To me, or professions, to me that's very exciting, and I'm very proud to represent an organization that welcomes everyone to the table. As long as you share our core mission and our values, we want you here so we can grow and learn.
Well, as somebody who's been with AMSA since 1983, but also as the executive director of women, we appreciate the partnership with AMSA.
Well, and I think we've had to evolve around that. What is a partner? You know, there were discussions. I remember discussions when I was at then the American Meat Institute. How could we partner? And you know, coming from, and this is Betsy speaking from my view, not necessarily the organization, but I remember thinking of, it's very hard when you have a trade association whose members give for a trade association to then say we could be sponsoring and doing other things. is there a way of partnership because we're aligned? And the organization didn't have some of those more formalized. So it's really gratifying to see, even for me in the professional time of having dialogue with AMSA staff, can we find partnerships, to now seeing those partnerships come to fruition and expanding, whether it's the women's group or other organizations throughout, like Manners, that we are able to build relationships with. We weren't doing that as well or as deliberate. Maybe that's a better way to say, deliberately saying we have partners and we're better for those partnerships.
I would agree with you 100%. It's been very gratifying.
It is.
And to your point, we have the same mission. We have the same values. We have the same goals.
Well, and we're all part of it. And I think that just shows the diversity of our industry. And, it makes it fun. I find it fun.
Fun and invigorating. Yeah. Which, it keeps you on your, the students keep me on my toes. My mentees keep me on my toes.
Well, and it's not just the students. I mean, I've been talking, asking, again, as president, you say, so any problems, questions, any compliments, and so you're ready to hear that. And as anyone knows who's been a career long enough, at least I found, you embrace critical criticism because it makes you better. And so, I'm talking to people, but what's interesting to me is, yes, the students, and I'm not trying to diminish the students, but I think we as professional organizations, societies, we honor our mentors, we honor our students, and I believe we sometimes forget to realize we have cohorts. I'm probably middle of my career, but I think about younger professionals, and are we serving them the best way we can? So what's been interesting to me, particularly with this RMC, I've been trying to be deliberate in talking to those that are no longer students, maybe 5 years in. What do they need? Mm-hmm. What helps them evolve? And that, to me right now, is where I'm getting some of my energy of, they have translated their student passion over to their professional, and they're trying to reconcile, how do I have a home life? How do I meet my personal goals? How do I meet my professional goals? And yet still come to an organization like this. And to me, that's an interesting energy that we haven't really tapped into. And wondering, from a board perspective, how do we support them better? Are we missing something? I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was going to be my last question, but any advice for the incoming president would be very appreciated.
I think, when I've been a part of member organizations, now I'm sitting in a corporate role, but, it's sort of like when you're in grad school and they say, which university do you go to? What I learned, because I went to 3 different universities, they teach the same stuff. I mean, you may pick an advisor and you need to focus and you go through that, but meat science is meat science. We all use the same textbooks. What's really interesting to me is the culture, the people, what you learn and grow from your cohort of grad students. You share these offices, you learn from them. And so my advice is the same advice that I've learned from grad school, and frankly, sort of my touchstone is what I've learned from Jim Hodges. And Jim Hodges hired me at the American Meat Institute. In fact, many people at the time this probably will come out will know, we honored him at the banquet as a special recognition award. And Jim was really what I thought was at the cornerstones of the meat industry. A lot of people don't know him. But what was interesting about Jim, and he was a leader in this trade association, he brought people together. But there were a couple things early on in my career that he says, you just need to know that there are a couple things. One, you're going to be graded by what the members think of you because you serve the members. So you need to listen. So that's the first thing. Advice, listen. What are people saying? What are people saying? And are you actually listening to what they're saying and hearing what they're saying? I think sometimes we listen, but we're not actually getting what they're trying to mean. But the other thing that Jim did, and this goes to listening, is when in doubt, ask the members. It's not Sharon that's AMSA. It's not Betsy who's AMSA. I may have a perspective, I may have a vision, but it's when in doubt, talk to the members. And that is a Jim Hodges I mean, that was one of the first things he said to me. And then when I went to my first performance review, I learned he followed that model and called members and said, so how did Betsy do this year? And that was all part of my performance review. So that's my advice. When in doubt, ask the members, because you may have a perspective, but you may not represent their perspective. So what are they thinking?
By the way, I told Jim you were doing a great job.
Jim. I'm looking forward to seeing him tonight. He's been retired for 10 years. I'm very happy that he's retired and done all that. I think it's what I would want to aspire to when I retired. He served the industry incredibly well, led them through very dark times. And yet when he decided it was his time, he sort of passed the baton, so to speak, and him and his family are living the best lives and enjoying their time. And I can't think of a better way to sort of end your career, doing what you want, when you want, and how you want to do it.
100%. But let's go back to your career, because you have had a very, we've talked about this, the career fair. 15 years ago, you had asked the students, what do you want to be when you grow up? And it's, I want to go in R&D, I want to go in food safety back when it was still glamorous, or I want to be grading carcasses. But there is so much more out there, and I think your career epitomizes that.
Well,
so tell us more.
I would say I am not your traditional AMSA student. I never judged meats, ever. I mean, I was a pre-med. My dad, I think people know, or may not. He's that old that they may not know him anymore, which is sort of ironical. I love that. No, my dad was a meat and extension specialist at Michigan State for 30 plus years. And so again, I attended RMC because frankly, we couldn't afford vacations, and they just put us in the car, and there we went. So I was actually pre-med going into undergrad, and I had to get a summer job, and I got a summer job working for Ann Hollingsworth, who at the time was at Bilmar Foods, which is now owned by Tyson, in the Zeeland facility she said, I need a gopher in the R&D department. I just need someone. I will pay you $10 an hour, which at that time was like
a princely sum.
It was a princely sum, and she's just like, work off, we'll just do all this. And so I was pre-med, had full intentions of going into medical school. I mean, at that time, ER was super big, and it was like, I'm going to be an emergency doctor, or I'm going to be this. After about 2 summers of doing that, it made me realize that, and I was working while I was in campus in the medical school, so I was in the post-education department. And I got to really experience, while not intern-like, meeting with doctors, talking with them, going through all that. And I realized that wasn't something I wanted to do for a variety of reasons. I've learned, the main one was learning that to be a human medical doctor, from my perspective, was I would get too caught up, too emotional into that. And as I was watching doctors do that, how they had to separate that to do their jobs. And I didn't think I could do that. But then really fell in love with food science. And at the time, meat science, protein chemistry. So switched the major, became a food scientist, went to Nebraska, got my master's there, and then got my PhD. And with the whole goal of going into R&D, that time at Bilmar really solidified, like, I like this. I like, creating and designing new foods and thinking about this and all of that. And I got out of grad school in 2008. And it was the recession. Mm-hmm. And no one would hire me. And when I no one, I mean no one would hire me. And I interviewed with the major companies. Then as those jobs started closing off, I started, interviewing for like ingredient companies and all stuff. And then that ended. And then I was very fortunate that I had worked with Dr. Rhonda Miller at Texas A&M, and I had a sensory background. So then I was applying for all these sensory jobs in the food industry. And like one by one, everything started closing. So I got to graduation. I was within a week of graduation, and the American Meat Institute posted a job, and I called Randy Huffman, who was an informal mentor for me. And that was a job from a policy standpoint, because I'd gone to food law in undergrad and done some study abroads at Michigan State that did that. I had an interest. But those jobs don't come open very often. Mm-mm. And they're rare. And I figured, well, that would be a great place to end my career. Okay, that's sort of how I viewed it. Like, this would be a goal, but this would probably be mid-career, end of career. job open, called Randy. He's like, well, it's a VP. You would be too young, but apply. You're the type of person we want. And I interviewed and got home 48 hours before I graduated. And as I was flying back to DC, they made the job offer. And so, I mean, that's how close I was to moving to the basement of my parents' house
We've all
in
been
Lansing, Michigan, and having to like go and become an hourly employee at Michigan State, working in labs or the cafeterias to pay the bills because I just couldn't find a job. So that's sort of how it started. And I got to DC by people. I have students ask, I really want to do your job. How'd you get it? Like, it's the only job offered to me. Like, when you get down to, you have no job and one job gets offered to you, I didn't feel like I could be picky. And so I took the job. And ironically, here I am, if I do the math right, 16 years later, in DC, still doing policy. Now that's 4 jobs ago. I've moved around a bit, but that was my tangled story of how I went from being pre-med to ending up in policy and have never left.
Since 1883, Ultrasource has been a trusted supplier to the food industry. Ultrasource provides superior kill floor, processing, packaging, and labeling equipment and operational supplies.
But 4 very different organizations. Tell us a little about that.
Yeah, so again, got into policy, and I started as Director of Scientific Affairs, and then at the what's now called the Meat Institute, but AMI, American Meat Institute at the time. That role was sort of the head scientist. And so I came in as Director of Science, but because of how that's happened and the history of that role, and I was coming in since Randy Huffman had departed, big shoes to fill, and had made a decision, I'm never going to be Randy, so I'm just going to be the best Betsy I can be.
100%.
Right. But that was a role where it was unique because I ended up staffing the board. And at a director's level, at that time at the Meat Institute, you were usually a VP or something else, but because I was the in-house scientist, I was coming in, and I was also part of the foundation at that time, the AMI Foundation. Now it's the Meat Institute Foundation. And so I would go, and Jim Hodges, who was my boss, both for the foundation and for the policy component of it. So I started there and had to run the Scientific Affairs Committee, worked with my colleagues in inspection, and got to meet members like yourself or get reconnected, but meet a lot of them. And so that was, for me, trial by fire, because my portfolio was anything sciencey. I mean, that was sort of outside of animal welfare, which at the time Janet Riley was leading. Anything sciencey came across my desk. That was animal health, that was food safety, that was nutrition. Again, if something happened in the industry and there was a science component on it, Jim Hodges and I were the people that, you just had to dig in and learn. So for me, that was a really good trial by fire of, I was a trained protein chemist. And yet, if you remember the swine influenza aspect, that became one of the issues we dealt with, I think, in 2010. Mm-hmm. And so, how do we handle something like that? What is the messaging? And so, it was a stretch, and you had to feel very uncomfortable. Then I went to OFW Law to be a policy advisor and supported a lot of the regulatory activities in their USDA and FDA practice. Was happy to be there, was learning. Many of my members now became part of clients. Then I had an opportunity to go at the time to the Grocery Manufacturers Association, another trade association that largely represented the consumer packaged good industry. And for those of you that follow in that space, GMA was going through some tough times, and there was a lot of issues, and they had a new CEO, and it was just a lot of this in that space. And they were looking for a head of regulatory. And I remember I was meeting with what soon to became my boss. And I took the meeting just because I wanted to see the guy who was taking on this dumpster fire. And he said, why did you take this interview? And that was the response I gave him. I was like, I really wanted to meet the guy who took this on. And I learned once I got to know him, that was the moment he knew he was going to hire me, because it was just, no nonsense and all of that. But was able to go what ultimately now is known as the Consumer Brands Association. And it was really being the regulatory expert for the consumer packaged goods industry. So we only had one meat member really, and that was Hormel. Now there are multiple ones, but I had to really tap into what I was doing at OFW from the FDA side. So our members were the Smuckers, the General Mills, the ConAgras, I mean, the big PepsiCo, Coca-Cola, but also P&G and Henkel and Clorox and all of those others that I had never had any experience in from that aspect. So I had to sort of dive in and learn about the regulatory aspects of making wipes. And during COVID, how do you get approval real time to prove that the disinfectants that were being used could cover for coronavirus? Again, a lot of similar processes of like, how do you change a label in the food industry? But I got to see that real time for that side of the consumer packaged goods industry. So it was super interesting. And then again, not looking for a new job, but I saw this thing posted by someone at Tyson, but it was opening in the Washington, D.C. office at Tyson Foods. And it was a position under Barb Masters. Well, when Barb departed OFW, that's how, sort of went there for that. And Barb's been an informer mentor to me. And I looked at the job and I was like, wow, this is like, it's been written for me. And so I knew I had to, apply, and I had a conversation with her and applied and had to go through the interview process. And so now I'm at Tyson Foods working for a lady I consider a personal friend. I'm blessed about that, but just admire her career, her thought process, her respect. And we went from a team of 1, and now we're a team of 4 in the Reg Policy Unit in Washington, D.C., working right along our government affairs people. So it's a weird path, but I'm doing corporate, and I'm doing a lot of the same stuff that I was doing in regulatory, but through a corporate lens and learning that. So it's been fun.
So last question.
Yeah.
With all of that, so I happen to know which birthday you're coming up upon, but
yeah.
So if you could go back 50% of your life, what's the one thing you would say, do this instead or be this instead?
No, I'll take it a little differently because, like you, I mentor people, and I have imposter syndrome. I finally figured out what that is and learned that is something that I think crippled's not the right word. I mean, I've been accused of being aggressive and intimidating, and it's always amazing how those comments come out, and it's usually from people I've learned that are too insecure to understand that, but I don't think they mean it as an insult, but from someone that they're saying it to, I took it as like they were criticizing me. Mm-hmm. So the one thing that came to me, and it's still something now that I resonate on, is the gentleman that hired me at Consumer Brands, Jeff Freeman. We were doing some pre-meetings, and it was a tough culture we were walking in. And he said to me, quit trying to prove that you need to be in the room. And I looked at him, I said, what do you mean? He goes, I can tell. And this gentleman was the biggest advocate for women. He loves surrounding himself with smart people. He went out of his way to surround himself with smart women. I got to know his wife, and it makes much more sense, and he's got daughters and all that. But he told me, he said, and he was working with someone, and I didn't know at the time when I went through the interview process, I got interviewed by, you could say, a workplace psychologist, but she was an HR person and exceptionally well, and a coach. And she, I guess, honed in on where she thought my vulnerabilities were and gave him some advice on how to coach me to be a leader. And so he told me, so very long-winded, quit trying to prove that you need to be in the room. You are going to alienate other people. They're not going to recognize that it's your insecurities that are making you do this. They are going to see it as, you're either a know-it-all, you're intimidating. He goes, stop having to prove that you're in the room. You're in the room because you're smart enough to be in the room. Be in the room and do the job I hired you for and lead. And that, to me, for me, at that time in my career, was one of the most freeing things ever. And I got to meet the lady that gave him the advice. She still coaches me. She was a great asset. I mean, I give this man credit. He knew he had a different culture, and he intentionally brought in someone as a tool to his leadership team to make this work. I took advantage of that. But I appreciated her read, and we talked about it later. She goes, no, you're classic. And it was very interesting to me, but that to me has been the most freeing thing. And I wish I would have known that in grad school. I wish I would have known that going into that, because it sort of opens it all up, at least it did for me, to realize you got the job, you're in the room. If you weren't supposed to be in the room, you wouldn't be in the room. Now, that's not all situations. I get that. But if you can get in the room, you deserve to be there, and start thinking about that versus all the other stuff going on, and realize, what can I do? How can I drive that forward? For me, that was incredibly freeing. And I actually said it last week to one of my mentees. She was taking a new job. And she's like, how do I try to do things and not feel like I'm changing everything? And I finally, as we were having the conversation, I said, why are you saying that? And what we got down to is she was trying to prove that she was the right person for the job. I mean, ultimately, I think that's where she was going. And she finally admitted that. And I said, let me give you a piece of advice. You got the job. Stop wasting energy trying to interview and get the job because you've already got it. Do the job and move forward. And I know that's maybe a little cynical, but for me it was super freeing. And I could see her sitting there like, oh, I'd never thought of it that way. Like, I'd never thought about it this way. Why am I, like, you're indirectly still interviewing for a job you've already got. Quit wasting time and energy on that, and let's focus on making the changes you want and doing it in a way that's successful for you, but also for your team. Changed the whole conversation, and it was really, I think, eye-opening for her, but that's my one thing, Sharon.
That's awesome. And if you are not going to be in the session later with Eilert and myself, because we're teaching soft skills, why they picked the two of us is a little beyond me.
There's some joke about you're all huggy and soft and you want hugs, not slugs, like something like that. I'm sure there's some joke there.
If you happen to be in the room, please share that.
Yeah.
Because that is just extremely powerful advice.
And I'd never heard anyone frame it to him. So, I mean, as much as sometimes that boss drove me crazy and we went at it, he always had a respect for me. I always had a respect for him. But to me, that was one of the most freeing things. And I tell him that when I see him, because I want him to know that that was really insightful and game-changing for me.
Is that why you left behind the dinosaurs?
He was too easy to make fun of. For the audience, I have a boss who had very strong opinions, and it was he liked building culture, but he would do some things, and we just set him up. He walked right into things, and we opened the door for him to walk right into it. But and he had a good sense of humor. Not everyone would take the sort of office jokes. They weren't mean, but some people would get upset. He rolled with it, and we're still doing it to him. He has no idea that his assistant is going to be receiving something, and I know the second he sees it in his office, because he's one job away, he's just, I know I'm going to get a text message like, really? Really? But the funny thing is, he still has it, because every once in a while I will get messages, but he's kept them all. Like, they're sitting in a closet, and he'll come across it because he gets what it means. It was a thing of respect. So,
well, thank you, Betsy.
Thank you,
and thanks to the MeatsPad.
Appreciate it. It's been fun.
Really appreciate this opportunity to talk to some of our women members. AMSA current president Betsy Booren.
102 E's. Boring Betsy. It's the easiest way.
Thanks, Betsy.
Thank you.
And probably time to get back to the meeting.